Hi, good morning. It looks like there's a few people on the webinar already. We'll get started here at 9:30. I'm not trying to jump the gun, but if you can hear me and if you can see my desktop, can you enter just any text at all in the question and answer box, just so I know that we've got our audio visual up and running. Thank you. Okay, well, good morning, guys. So it is 9:30. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who have colleagues that are going to tune in but aren't here quite yet, don't stress about it too much. We're going to record this and make sure that it's online so everybody has a chance to look at it later on. A few minutes ago, I asked if everybody was able to see my screen and hear my audio, and it looked like that all checked out. But if you are having trouble, I can see what you're typing in the question and answer box. So don't hesitate to kind of use that to communicate with me if there's things that we need to do. So you have in front of you the 2019 AHFA. It's going to look a whole lot like the 2018 AHFA. If you did submit an application last year, you should be very, very comfortable using this format. We tried not to make any changes unless they were going to really help with usability, or if they were going to kind of make sure that the AHFA moved in tandem with the QAP. So things that were really critical. Before we get started, just know everybody is on mute right now, so you do have to use that checkbox. I'll make sure that this video is posted online before I leave. And I do want to thank the handful of our private partners, a few developers who helped us test the AHFA this year. You turned up a lot of really great feedback, and I really kind of value that relationship because it lets us put an extra set of eyes on it and not just kind of have a few extra layers of review, but also I think that you use the AHFA in a very different way than we do, and it helps us make sure that kind of all of those different life cycles are being kind of tested and stressed before we finalize it. So thank you so much for that. I do want to let those of you know who already have downloaded this AHFA. It is already out of date. We uploaded a brand new one this morning. To thank one of those particular testers, some of our friends at National Church NCR, noticed that there was a very small formula error in the competitive scoring workbooks for the senior urban and non-urban new affordability categories in the supporting integrated communities section. So we just went in, cleaned up that formula error and reposted it, and that's back up online now. But in general, whenever you're working with an AHFA, make sure that one of the first things you do is you scroll to the instructions tab, and in the very top left-hand corner, you'll see a release date. The current release date, the most recent release date is now November 28th, 2018, so that's today. If you're never entirely sure which AHFA you're looking at and whether it is the most recent one, that's certainly understandable. What I would recommend is making sure that you are signed up for the Planning, Preservation, Development newsletter on OHFA's website. At the bottom of that newsletter, we have kind of a running story, a running section that says what the most recent AHFA date is. So you can always kind of compare the AHFA to the newsletter and know whether or not you're looking at an older version. So the biggest changes to the AHFA this year are really kind of data quality. So we updated the new qualified census tracts and difficult development areas. For those who've been waiting with bated breath for the AHFA to finally drop, that was what was holding us up. HUD produces those data points, and they were a little bit later this year than they normally are. So as soon as those came out, we were able to upload. We've also updated the competitive scoring workbooks to reflect any changes that were in the QAP. System-wide, the biggest change you'll see, especially if you didn't fiddle around with it too much in the fall, was income averaging. The budget tab in particular is going to look a little bit different. It's going to be slightly more chaotic feeling because there's a lot of cross-references and checks that we need to make sure are part of the formulas now, but that is fully integrated. And from a usability perspective, we've also kind of gone through each of the tabs and tried to unlock some of the spaces between, which isn't going to be visually any different for you. But for folks who are copying and pasting from last year's AHFA, maybe a resubmitted development that you're bringing around again, but you want to start from scratch on a new AHFA, it should be a little bit easier to copy and paste now. So if you haven't downloaded it already, the AHFA is available on OHFA's website. It's under -pp&d-resources. And this is where you're going to find all of our program non-specific forms and templates. If you scroll to the bottom, the standard form, the AHFA is right here. It's this first line item. Also, if you were to toggle to the different tab, This is where you're going to get our design and architectural standards and our underwriting and implementation guidelines. So a lot of our kind of generally applicable forms are available on that resources page. Getting back to the AHFA in particular, there's, I guess what I'm going to do is just start with the instruction tab and kind of work my way over. I'll walk through a very, very abbreviated kind of completed application so that you can see some of the different tips and tricks that we've got in there. But from a master perspective, you will want to make sure that you're running Excel 2013 or newer. If you have an older version, as you're aware, there's a lot of tabs, a lot of data, a lot of cells that are filled out. Anything prior to 2013 really just can't handle that much information. And not only will things not run quickly or effectively, there are things that you just won't see that will be part of the application, but you won't be aware of it. So I would hope that nobody's kind of running that old of a platform, but make sure you do update. In general, I view the AHFA on 85% zoom. So if you look down here in the right-hand corner, you can go in and you can go out based on whatever your comfort level is. For me, I always think that 85 is both viewable, and it's also the easiest way to make sure that the entire AHFA is displaying on one screen to the extent that it's feasible. But I will caution you that there's some tabs where we have to collect so much information that you will still need to scroll to make sure you're doing it. So I'll show you the budget tab real quickly as one. The sources and uses, it spreads out quite a bit to the right. So just as a general rule, make sure that you are kind of scrolling and checking and not missing any information that's there. Also, in general, the AHFA is laid out so that you complete the tabs kind of sequentially. So you start with the instructions, and then you move into project details, budget, housing credits, and kind of go left to right. But OHFA is well aware that that's not how most people will use the AHFA. I think most of our developers, and whenever we're screwing around ourselves, you kind of start with the budget tab, and then you peek in on cash flow every once in a while. And then maybe you will circle your way back to the proposal summary before hitting the competitive scoring workbooks. We know that you're going to go out of order, and it's certainly fine to do that. The AHFA is not going to stop you, but just be aware that there are a lot of different cells that link to other areas of the AHFA. So if you go sequentially, it's most likely that the cells you're encountering that are going to have auto-population will have already been completed. And if you are going out of order, there could be cells that are locked and that are empty and that shoot up error messages and flags because you haven't filled in kind of that foundational information yet. So if you've got any issues like that, usually the first order of business is to go see where that cell is linking from and then complete that. I think this is going to be the last year where I'll have to give the dire warning, do not copy and paste from older AHFAs, from those AHFAs prior to last year, just because there are a lot of different things happening in the background and a lot of different formulas and macros and things that you really don't want to carry over into this new format. That warning is not as critical if you are using last year's AHFA because now they're all kind of in that same genre. In general, though, if you are using copy-paste, especially if you're using it liberally, always use the values paste option. And because I have said this enough times and there were less people who didn't really know what that feature looked like, on the instructions tab now, right here, we have just kind of a quick step-by-step on what values paste is and how to use it. And it'll save you a lot of headaches. Worst case scenario, what you don't want to do is accidentally override a formula that then creates kind of a running error that makes it very difficult to fix later on. Similarly, and again, I don't think this necessarily needs to be said too often, but do not jailbreak the AHFA. There are tools out there where you can crack the code and you can get around the passwords and the protections that are set up. Don't do it because first, it means that all the work that we put into making this is not too awfully useful, and it makes our staff sad. It makes me sad. But more importantly, there are tools out there that kind of reset to factory settings. So when OHFA receives the AHFA back now, if we reset an AHFA that has been jailbroken, all of the changes that you've made go away, and it would very significantly change the information that you'd entered. So as long as you are kind of not getting around the passwords, you'll be fine. From an organizational standpoint, on the instructions tab, you can see here how we have different color coding to indicate different things. If you have a light blue box, it's pretty much an unrestricted answer. So you can go in these light blue boxes and type whatever you want. There's no controls associated with them. The dark teal are drop-down boxes, which means that you can enter some information, but OAFA is kind of limited what can be in there. The light gray boxes are going to be locked entirely. So there's nothing you can do to change here, even if you wanted to. And then the dark gray boxes are those boxes that technically are not locked. You can go in there and change them. But the dark gray is a warning that it's really, really unlikely that you would ever need to go and change those. So a good example is if you look at the housing credit tab and you look at the applicable tax credit percentage, if you're doing a competitive 9% deal, yeah, it's pretty much guaranteed that your tax credit percentage is going to be 9%. So there would be very little reason to change that, but it is unlocked if there was some incredible uncertainty that needed to kind of adjust there. Also throughout, there will be error messages and warnings, just things that pop up to indicate whether or not you're in conformity with the QAP or whether there's a conflict in the different things that you've entered into the AHFA. Just know that we can't enter a warning flag for every contingency possible. So don't lean on them too awfully hard. Make sure that you're constantly reading the QAP and cross-checking all of your information on your own. Also be aware that we have information here on the instructions page regarding fraud. And if you do suspect fraud or you know of someone who has committed fraud, there's a link here where you can report it. In general, it's not a great idea to submit any information in support of an application, either in the AHFA or the supporting documents, that you know is not correct or not authentic or not current. Submitting any false or misleading information is going to subject you to a whole course of penalties, some within OAFA and some that could certainly implicate legal authorities. So that's kind of the deep, dark, and scary, right? When you are submitting documents in support of the AHFA, here are the charts with the naming conventions. Just go ahead and use them exactly as they are. So if you are going to submit just a plain old 9% deal, this is probably what your folder is going to look like for your proposal application. You've got it numbered sequentially according to what OAFA said, and you're using the same names that OAFA says. And then you have a single subfolder for your competitive support documentation. And you can see that we've numbered these all just straight sequentially, which means that there are a number of cases where you might be missing a number 3 because you don't need to submit an appraisal, or you might be missing a number 5 because for whatever reason. So don't instantly worry if you don't have every single number on the list. Right now, the only document that needs to be submitted in hard copy outside of the compact disc that you'll submit are the architectural plans. We've eliminated the hard copy of the site visit folder this year, so we're trying to really scale down the amount of just paper that you submit to us. Also, we do not need original signatures on anything related to the proposal application. In prior years, there were a number of folks who submitted original signatures on the program certification page where you would actually have your GP sign this. You're welcome to do that. We will accept it. But we have unlocked this page now where you can upload an image, a JPEG of a signature, and just submit it right here in the AHFA without kind of converting it to any other format, and we will accept that as well. Also new this year is all 9% applications have a flat application fee. They had previously been gradated based on how many you were submitting, but now every single app is $3,500 per. Because it is standardized like that, we will not be invoicing anymore. All tax credit applications have to include a check or money order payable to OAFA for that application fee. For those who've been on the scene for a while, we do not have a DevCo application at this moment. So what you submit to OFA on the CD and in this AHFA is all you will submit. We do not have an online portion. We're kind of continuing to explore whether that's something that can be feasibly revived, whether it's useful to our partners. That DevCo component will not be here for the 2019 round, so you can kind of take that out of your mind. But we are trying to identify whether we can have an upload option. So instead of submitting hard CDs to OFA by mail, you'd be able to upload your supporting documents. We're kind of in the early stages of discussing whether or not we have the bandwidth to do that at this point, and whether it can be operationalized fast enough to be effective in February without crashing in the middle of the evening, which I know nobody wants. So we'll certainly keep you in a loop. It's something that you might see debuted. You might see it debuted as an optional, but we don't have a whole lot of information about that at this stage right now. And then finally, from kind of a big picture standpoint, all of the branded documents are now online. So you have the QAP up there with the final page numbers, the underwriting and implementation guide, the design and architectural standards. All of those have been posted. We've also posted a new exception request form. It looks very, very much like what you saw last year, but we did update it for the new page numbers with the new branding, and there's also a new exception that you can request relative to income averaging. So those are all up online now. I'm going to kind of keep the question and answer box in my sightline as we're going through this, and I'm not seeing anything come in yet, so I'm just going to dive straight into the AHFA demo. But if you need me to slow down, enunciate, whatever I can do to make this a little bit easier, just let me know. So starting left to right, the first tab that you would come to is the Transmittal tab. This is for OFA information only. Every single box on this tab pre-populates, and they are all locked. Well, they should all be locked. But there's nothing that you need to do on this page, so you can just go ahead and skip it. Very similarly, the proposal summary is just a roll-up of information that you enter elsewhere. It is another one of those quick looks. This one is a little bit more detailed than the transmittal. This one's used more frequently by our board or people who have budget and finance questions. The only thing that you as an applicant will do on this page is that you will upload a photograph or a rendering of the project. But I need to warn you, because we need you to be able to upload a photograph or rendering, we are unable to lock the balance of this page. So technically, if you wanted to, you could go in here and start moving things around and entering text. Just don't. There's no reason to do that. It's going to be fine. But we can't lock it down, or else we wouldn't be able to get the picture. The one new thing I want to draw your attention to on this tab is there is now a section at the bottom for the composite score. And because we haven't entered any data right now, it's got kind of a place filler in there that says no pool selected. But soon enough, once these are PDF'd, they will all be put on our website early to mid-February. As soon as the applications come in, you'll be able to check in and see where your composite score stands relative to other applicants in your pool, which is something we had a lot of requests for. Onto the project details tab, and this is where I'm going to start entering a little bit of information for kind of a dummy application, but just be aware nothing's going to reconcile, it's not going to match, it's going to be an absolutely jumbled file once it's all said and done. But I want you to be able to see how certain things interrelate. So some of the most critical pieces of information, you're always going to need a zip code and a census tract number, because that's what's going to populate these cells over here that talk about the demographic features of the site itself, whether it's on a high opportunity rating, what its change rating is, whether it's QCT or DDA. Because those do link between each other, you need to be very, very careful to kind of follow the formatting that's prescribed. So the zip code here in C11 has to be 5 digits and 5 digits only. You can add the 4 quantifiers on at the end in the next cell. And then even more importantly, because this carries through a lot of different tabs and a lot of different features on the AHFA, the census tract has to be the 11-digit version. It cannot be one of the ones that has either dashes or spaces in it. So there's instructions here on how to do it. You can also click here, which is linked to the website where you can find out that information. It looks like this. I'm not going to fill it in right now because it's kind of arduous to do it the first time around, but what it spits out is something that looks like this. And this is how you get your 11 digits. So 39,049,0093, skip the decimal, 85 is your 11 digit. And that should work for every site in the country, but certainly in Ohio. Continuing on, I'm just going to enter some more information so that we've got kind of a foundation upon which we can do the rest of our playing. Perfect. Okay, so kind of starting on this tab then and going through the bottom of it, the first thing you'll see, the very first box up here is application number. If you are submitting a proposal application in advance of February, you do not have an application number. That won't be assigned to you until after submission. So you can skip that box and it won't be relevant until you come back in September for your final. But then you enter general basics, project name, address, all of the things that I've already entered. And that goes here. The county is a drop down, so make sure that you're kind of spelling correctly. And then to your right, you'll find other information, and these are all relevant to both scoring and kind of general eligibility. So you'll just fill out as needed. And then similar here with pool information, it's really important that you get these kind of correct to what you're trying to do because it unlocks other features. So one of the easiest ways to kind of show you this is when you select your pool, make sure you're selecting the right pool. I want to be competing in general occupancy, but suppose I had actually wanted to compete in senior and I just picked the wrong one. I would have an immediate problem because it has not unlocked the senior tab. Right now, the only one that's unlocked is general occupancy. So that's kind of a long way of saying if you find yourself in scoring and you're going, oh my gosh, my whole tab is dark, why is this? Make your way back to the project details tab and just change this particular line and you'll be fine. Line 24 here is new. So this is kind of one of those areas where I'm going to warn you that copying and pasting from last year, because we've added a new row into the formulas or into the cell, is going to be a little bit challenging. And kind of as a general rule across the board, we did add a few things here, we tweaked a few things there, but like this, none of them are gotcha questions. You're going to know the answer. It's going to be very intuitive right off the bat. So whether you're a proposal or final application, shouldn't really hang anybody up too awful much. I also want to note very quickly the cell here at F8, which is whether the applicant appealed the opportunity rating. It is one of the dark gray cells, which means technically you can change it. You can flip this over to yes, but it's really not likely that you're going to do so. And if you are, you've already been in contact with OHFA. So technically it is possible to appeal your opportunity rating, the one that Kerwin mapping dictates. Really, there's only one reason why you can do that, which is in some parts of Cleveland and in some parts of Columbus, the school district boundaries do not neatly overlap with census tracts. And it's really only in those two jurisdictions. So when Kerwin runs their analysis, they have to make assumptions about which school districts are going to apply for Columbus schools and Cleveland City schools. If you look at your opportunity rating and you say, well, shoot, this says that I'm supposed to be in Columbus City schools, but actually I'm in Pickerington schools, that's where you can contact OHFA for a customized AHFA and to appeal that opportunity rating. In the years that we've been doing opportunity mapping, I've seen this happen once, so it's very much not common. But if you think you've got that situation on your hands, definitely reach out to us. Oh man, what did I just do there? Okay, back on track. Another question that came up last year is we have a section here that says legally required wage rates, whether it's Davis Bacon or Ohio prevailing wage. Just make sure that if you're filling this box out with any of them, but particularly with the other category, that it is a wage rate that is legally required, that you have to be able to point to a statute or a city code or some sort of regulation that is going to mandate the development to use that wage, and then it's not optional. So I don't know if that's an issue across the board, but we've seen that from time to time in Northeast Ohio. Moving down, here we have the permanent supportive housing eligibility check. This is just kind of a quick visual reminder that to even be able to compete in the PSH category, including for any of the set-asides therein, you still need to meet the definition of permanent supportive housing. And here under our QAP in Ohio, at least 60% of your units need to serve that PSH population to compete under that pool. And this is just kind of letting you know, red flag right away, if you have a deal where it's not going to be eligible. So that's not going to apply to the substance abuse recovery pool, just the PSH pool. Under the population served, so we get a little bit of information about what subsidies you have. There is a section 811 here. Remember, that's the 811 capital advance, not the 811 PRA program, because we like to make things nice and clear, so we use the same name for 4 or 5 different programs. But under population served, what I wanted to draw your attention to is if you are offering senior housing, you are going to be selecting one of the HOPA exceptions, the housing for older persons. So you need to identify which set of the population you are going to serve, whether it's adults aged 55 and older or adults exclusively aged 62 and older, and make sure that you fill that out. In prior years, that was not a data point that OFA needed, but it is in the AHFA now. Scrolling down, we are now into the site and building acquisition section. Just right off the bat, one of the things you're going to see is there's a lot more cells here than there were last year. I think last year we stopped at 35. Now it goes up to 100, just because there are those developments where you're going to have 100 different buildings, and we didn't want to have everybody filling out a different AHFA. So if you're the lucky guy who has one building, just bear with you while you scroll down for a little while. This is another part of the AHFA where I want you to be very, very careful about copying and pasting from last year, because we do have a brand new cell. This cell K did not exist last year. So if you copy and paste, you're essentially going to be one off unless you're aware that that's there. And it's just for the date the building itself was originally constructed. Somewhat similarly, if you scroll over to the right to some of these other cells, also, it's not a new column entirely, but there is a new drop-down option for your building type. So now it's either going to be single-family, duplex, tri or quad, townhome, low-rise, or high-rise. And I think last year we had used some language that was a little bit imprecise. We said, you know, is it like a garden, flat, different things that weren't entirely well-defined. This list now matches what your management companies will fill out on the DevCo online component. So we kind of have more of a symbiosis between development and then management. Down below all of these, all of this was here last year, so there's not a lot of new information. Here is a section that has been added this year just for your convenience. Kind of a quick look on whether or not you've identified enough units to hit your 504 requirements for both mobility and sensory, and if you had started to enter any information in the budget and cost tab that suggested you didn't have enough units based on what was entered up over here, it would just shoot off a red flag and let you know that additional units need to be kind of updated and measured. All of this is the same, maybe a little bit of reformatting just to make things a little bit easier. If you're going to have non-residential structures, accessory buildings, maintenance sheds, common areas that are not attached to the tax credit development but are a standalone facility, not only do you need to provide the number of structures that exist and the square footage, but this year we're just asking for a very quick description on what that is. That's information that we had previously collected on a separate form with our architectural information. That just kind of brings all the different parties together. The development schedule is the same. The floor area, all of this is the same as last year. As a reminder, anything you see here with a little red triangle, if you hover over it, you can get more information. And here on the square footage definitions, that's tended to be quite helpful to some people. If you need the longer version, the deeper explanation for floor area and those definitions, you can go into the design and architectural standards. And then finally, at the bottom here, we get more information about project history. We have added a couple new cells. We're now asking about HDAB in addition to tax credits. We are also asking whether you've ever applied for tax credits before. We had only asked whether you'd ever received tax credits before. But this is going to let us better kind of align with what we have in DevCo. So that way we can identify whether there's a resubmitted, resyndicated project and link them in our information system. If you do indicate whether this project has received credits in the last 10 years, you're going to get an additional drop down of information. 10 years is a relevant threshold because that's going to impact credit availability. So we'll have to gather a lot more information from there. Okay, any questions about the project details tab? That's the first big one. Once we're through project details and budget, I can very nearly let y'all go home and carry about your days. Okay. So then the next tab that we come to is budget and cost. And again, this tab is where you're going to see the most change year over year, just because we did have to add in income averaging. But right at the outset, I want to let you know that all 811 units have to be entered into these cells only. They have to be entered into those kind of slightly darker blue shaded cells because the formulas relative to them are very specific. And when they were unrestricted in the past, we had people interpreting them differently. And it changed quite a bit, your net rent. So this kind of avoids those interpretation areas and makes sure that you were looking at the correct subsidy amount. Because income averaging has to kind of readjust how we're looking at things, in addition to your 811 units being divvied up here at the bottom, all non-tax credit market rate units also have to be at the bottom, as well as your manager unit or units. If you do enter any of those up here, it's going to throw off the rest of the math. So make sure that you're kind of aware of that. I'm going to enter a little bit of information. I've got a copy paste here that I'm just going to kind of, so I don't have to enter a bunch of numbers, but we can look at something. And by the way, I'm just borrowing these numbers from one of our 2018 applicants. So if anybody recognizes which deal I'm borrowing from, bonus points to you. So now that we've got a little bit of information in there, we can scroll down here, and these are basically just roll-ups. It's different ways of cutting and slicing the information that you've entered so that we can make sure different requirements and thresholds are being met. So kind of here we look at the number of units that are tax credit versus market, and then we look at different buckets. How many units are at or below 60, 50, 35, 30, and 15. And then when you move to the right of that, we look specifically at each of the income averaging brackets, so 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80. And with all of that information, then you see this green box pops up what your income average is for the entire development. Over to the right here, this grayed out section, most of those are relative to thresholds and are just cross-checks for our underwriting team to make sure that anything that's in the QAP that must be satisfied is satisfied. You may be more interested in these boxes here, which are the heavy-duty thou shall meet boxes. And this lets you know whether you're meeting the 60, 40, 50, 20, or income averaging test. And the big thing I want to kind of mention here, at least in passing, is that even if you meet income averaging and you get a yes popped up here, if you are doing a 4% deal, you need to make sure that you're also meeting one of the set-asides for 60, 40, or 50, 20, so that you can hit your 175 or your 142 requirements for the bonds. There is a competitive tax credit only requirement that you also have 60% and 40% at 60% if you're doing income averaging. And then there are competitive incentives that are also kind of itemized up here. if you're going through this and you're seeing anything that doesn't make sense, or that you know you have a unique situation and you want your underwriter to be aware about it, that's what this box is for right here. So going down a little bit further, we have the vacancy rate, we have our operating budget, and again, I can enter a little bit of information here just to make it something for us to talk about and look at, but there's not a whole lot that really needs to be customized. These numbers kind of self-populate and specific to your project. Okay. Operating, utility budget, all of these, you know, if you've been doing tax credits, this the format, the colors might look a little bit different than you've done in the past, but really we've requested essentially the same information for as long as we ever have. Under operating budget, we now start to get into your financing and your sources and uses. So this starts off with your construction financing. I'm not going to enter too much in there. Just be aware that loan terms here and AM term is in months, not years. Typically, you're going to look at what, 24, 36. Information then skips down to your permanent. So was it mark to market? Is it RAD? That is a new question in the last few years, whether or not you're part of a RAD program. Some narrative questions, looking at eligible basis and whether there's anything we really need to deduct out. So non-HTC qualifying units of a higher quality. This was a question that last year used to be tagged on here. It kind of lived to the right, so we would ask at the individual unit level. But there were a lot of folks who didn't scroll over to see that column existed. So we've just kind of relocated it down here. And whether you've got any federal grants that are going to defray costs. And then we're here into your actual funding sources for the perm side. And I'll just throw in a couple dummies here so that we can look through an example. So right away, I'm glad it popped up so quickly, because you can see that this is one of those areas where a flag will come in. Your amortization term cannot be 0 on any hard debt if you want the cash flow to be able to work. So if you do not enter an AM term, it will warn you, and that will pop up. Similarly, if you don't enter an interest rate on any debt, the AHFA itself will kind of pre-enter a really de minimis amount, like 0.00001 interest rate, just so that the pro forma will run without errors. And your deferred fee, if you don't enter a term on that, again, the pro forma, the cash flow tab, will assume a 15-year repayment, kind of based on what your typical schedule looks like. So if you don't want those presets to kick in, just make sure you enter it here. This is another area where you can kind of see how that dark shaded gray comes into play. So if you're looking at national or state trust fund or home dollars, and you've got a HDAP loan, 2% interest rate is pre-entered here, because it's really unlikely that OFA would offer a loan term outside of 2% interest rate. That's pretty typical to what we do on all of the projects that get those sources. But should you really need to, for whatever reason, you can go in and change it. Okay. Looking into cost and eligibility basis, I'll kind of, as I'm talking, try and enter some numbers in here. So we've got a little bit of something to look at as we're going forward. But this looks very, very similar to what we did last year. In fact, I don't believe there were any significant or substantive changes in this category. So if you are doing a copy and paste, should be no problem whatsoever. The only thing that we did do differently, if you kind of followed what happened in the QAP, developer support budget is now different from the developer fee, which is a whole conversation that I'm happy to have. It's going to make things a lot easier. But if for whatever reason your developer support budget exceeds 1.75 million, this is where you would get an error message. So that's going to come up from down here. So again, just be aware. Sources and uses. Now, you can see here that these are all blacked out because we don't have information entered up here. So when you are filling out your permanent financing, you can see that I left all these source names blank. I entered a number but no name, and that's why it's blacked out, because the AHFA doesn't believe that there's anything there to be entered. Now, if I enter name here, name, 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 and then scroll back down, all of a sudden you can see that these blue cells open back up. Just kind of cueing in the underwriting team and the AHFA itself that there's information that needs to be entered here. Also, when you were filling in just the cost, it's broken by acquisition, rehab, new construction basis versus non-basis. But you've got all of these kind of warnings that what you've entered in the cost does not yet match your sources and uses. So don't freak out yet. The reason it's not matching is because you haven't entered anything down here. And once you start doing that and you start filling in these sections, you're going to see those melt away. And I think that that's already started. See how some of those have begun to clear out because now you have both of those sections matching each other. What you'll want to do is after you fill these both out, come back here, take a look, and if there's anything that still has an error message, it means that something isn't reconciling between your costs and your sources and uses and how you're breaking it down between those different funding sources. One of the things to note as you're doing this from a kind of a practical matter, these side columns are all unlocked. So if you just want to do some quick formula errors, or I'm sorry, some formulas and some kind of back of the napkin math, that's all unlocked so that you can. But your underwriters are probably not going to scroll over this far to see it. So don't put anything in this area that's critical to your application because it's not likely that anybody's going to be looking for it. On the other hand, if you do have details or notes or something that you need the underwriter to be aware of that's not asked for anywhere else, that's what this box here is for. So just this is the any other notes, this is the free-for-all and what you want to tell the underwriter. Also new this year, something that we had kind of an audience request for is this is the cost containment check. It populates based on what you entered in that proposal summary, what the QAP says that your cost limitations are. So a development competing in a general occupancy pool can be neither higher than $280 per unit or $235 per square foot. And then it tells you based on what you've already entered where you're sitting as a development. So if I go back here and enter anything on here. You'll see how that has now populated up here. And you can see that on both the TDC and the gross square foot, this hypothetical is still well under what it should be. There you go. I wouldn't rely on that too hard because this is only calculating what you've entered. So if you go back and you change numbers halfway through kind of constructing your deal, always make sure that you're going back and checking that cost containment section too. I would probably look at this section as the very last thing I do before I submit it, because we've certainly been in the situation very recently, in fact, where development made some very, very, very minor changes at the last minute, which ended up putting them about 75 cents over the threshold, which is a real nightmare because this is non-negotiable. This is make it or break it. It's non-waivable or acceptable. So definitely make sure you're checking in on it frequently. And then down below, this is all stayed the same. So we've got some questions here about whether you're using historic tax credits. That's going to be relevant to whether we need to kind of back them out of the LIHTC component. And then your construction cost detail, which is often done in coordination with, the architect or the general contractor. At the very bottom, you have the definitions for what those trade descriptions are. So that is the budget tab. Up next, housing credits. Not a lot of changes you're going to see here. Again, on your right side, these are really just reference points, so you kind of are aware of what has already been entered. Almost everything on here is going to auto-populate. You can enter how many of your sites are QCT, which will affect your basis boost. You've got your not just the statutory basis boost for QCT DDA, but we also have the discretionary state boosts. And those are, again, pulled from other areas of the AHFA that you've probably already created once you're kind of hitting this page. The only new items that we do have is the minimum set aside has always been here, but we do now have the income averaging. Because we have income averaging, we have to ask how you're going to be making that 8B election at 8609, how you're going to treat multiple buildings. Keep in mind that for income averaging, you have to treat the entire project as one giant building. You cannot make that multi-building election. If you are going to do that, you need to have a justification and exception request to proceed. Cash flow, again, no changes from last year. The vast majority of this, this is all locked and auto-calculated. Really the only place that an applicant is going to enter information is in the pro forma to recognize either a tax abatement, an operating subsidy, or your mortgage insurance premium. And this is where you'll see your DCR and your cash flow and everything like that. Obviously, again, these numbers are completely wacky right now because we've only kind of half filled out our sources and uses. So don't look at the substance of what I've written, just look at the process of how I'm typing it out. We have received questions in the past about what this line here is. It's unlocked. It is incredibly unlikely that you would have anything to enter in here, but it's kind of the false if your underwriter has, on a one-on-one basis, approved something that is completely out of the ordinary, this is where you can type that in and make sure that's reflected in how the different numbers are aligning. But at least for as long as I've been here, this has never needed to be filled out. So I can't imagine most people would, would have a use for that either. All right, so we've gotten through the bulk of this now. Before I move on to the development team, are there any questions? All right, we're chugging through here. So development team, not any big changes here. You will see that there's a drop-down box that asks whether there's a co-developer agreement. If you are using a co-developer, that's now something that's required. AHFA doesn't need a copy of that agreement. We just need to know that one exists, and should that partnership fall through, or should there be any relationship challenges, AHFA will have kind of a guidebook on who to communicate with and who's kind of the lead in the primary. So we just need to know that that exists somewhere in the world. You will see a few changes to the names of different entities that we're using. Before we had used the phrase limited partner and general partner, which is great, but it was not really inclusive of all of the different kind of legal formats that we see come up. So we're being a little bit more general and talking about the ownership entity versus the managing partner. Really, all of this is more of an effort to get the application and some of the materials we're using on the front end to match the language and the materials that the management companies use on the back end. And our program compliance office offered some guidance that this might be a little bit more intuitive for their users. So that's really the big change here. And then you won't really see anything else. Down below, a couple new engineer, consultants, spaces here that are all optional if you have those people as part of your project team. And then experience and capacity has not changed at all since last year. Just keep in mind that there are certain ways that you can opt out of providing information. If you've developed more than 5 deals in the last 10 years, so we're all 9%, we don't necessarily need this information about the developer, because if you've done that many projects, we're pretty familiar with you already. But that does not carry through to co-developers, to owners, to construction companies. For all of those, we still need to get information. So it's a shortcut, but it's a small shortcut. The developer fee, again, this tab is just here as a courtesy. Obviously, the amount of fee that you're going to seek is a pretty multifaceted calculation. This basically just tells you in under the guidelines what is the maximum that you would be eligible for. So it does your per unit calculation, and then it also kind of triggers whether those different enhancers we're satisfied. And then it lets you know that if you're going to go do some of these specifically prevailing wage, that you need to provide support documentation. So on the 9% end, there's no changes to this except for those relative to income averaging. On the 4% side, though, there was a notable change in the underwriting and implementation guide this year. The long story is that the 4% fee used to be somewhat of a circular reference. It calculated the fee based on the fee, based on the fee, based on the fee. So it was kind of mathematically not possible the way that it had been calculating. So we've just kind of gone in and cleaned that up. And then this kind of breaks down how the different fee is being used out of those sources and uses in your budget tab. Be aware that if your developer fee exceeds 20% of your TDC, of your total cost, you're probably going to be getting a letter from the underwriter asking to explain why that is. So there might not be a hard and fast prohibition on it, but under OHFA's general obligation to ensure financial necessity and underwriting to the strictest standards. That's something that, if you see yourself hitting 20%, 25% here, regardless of whether you're in the 4 or the 9, make sure that you have a narrative justification ready to go for why that is. Speaking of narrative justification, when we did the AHFA relaunch and we kind of reformatted the entire thing, along with a QAP relaunch last year, and kind of started from scratch, we moved towards a system that was much more binary. Points were more yes, no, versus explain your project and tell us why you think you qualify for those points, which in many regards has been fantastic. It's much more predictable, it's much more scoreable, it's much more consistent in how we evaluate the project. There's 1.5 million great reasons to do it, but the one drawback is when you are submitting the application, that could lead to a little less flower, a little less color, a little bit harder of a way for us to see how your development really differentiates itself amongst its peers. So in lieu of having that from a competitive perspective, we've added this narrative tab where you can first provide a very short summary that will go online on the online summaries, but then also a much longer narrative. Which is optional. You do not need to use it at all. You do not need to use all of it if you don't want to. But the way that this is most likely to be used by OHFA is in our strategic initiatives decision-making process, where we have kind of gone through the formal competitive process, but we have this funny money left to play with, where we need to meet certain obligations to the state as a whole, and we have to kind of select which developments are best able to do that. And one of the factors that OHFA is always going to look at is, what's unique, what's cutting edge, what's transformative. This is a really great section for you to be able to share your insight on that question with us. The only thing I would beg you to please do is enter all of this narrative in a Word document and then copy and paste it in here, so that way you have all the spell checks. So it's very easy to do. You just copy and paste it straight up here into that section. But you can get quite a bit of text here. I think this is the statutory code to like tort law in Romania or something, and it fits the whole darn thing. So it's quite a big box. Okay, next tab, and then these I'm just going to breeze through because there's no changes from last year, and in fact, very few changes from any other AHFA that you've ever used here in Ohio, but this is the HDL and gap financing section. Almost everybody is probably going to fill out the HDL, but be aware that this is where credit gap lives, as well as multifamily lending programs. MLP is the easiest loan you'll ever apply for. You just enter in this box how much money you want, and then Matt Wooten calls you and you work through the details. His contact information is here. Certainly, if anyone's considering MLP for the upcoming February round, doesn't hurt to start talking now and figuring out what's available. The Design and Architectural Features tab, this had previously been a standalone form. This is one area where you do need to coordinate with your architect. So making sure that you maybe have the AHFA living on a share drive or a Google shared document site, something where, you know, multiple people can be accessing it at the same time and you're all looking at the most current information, would certainly be helpful if I were in your shoes. But aside from that guidance, there's really nothing that's changed here. We're going to get information about the building, when it was built, which of the accessibility codes you're going to be following, what exemptions you have, the scope of work. Really the biggest thing to keep in mind is make sure that all of this matches exactly what you're saying on the budget tab, and that both of those match what is actually happening in your architectural plans and your 80% plans or your preliminary plans. Yeah, wow, that's great. So this is a lesson in saving as often as you possibly can. Okay, looks like we're back online. Again, I'm not going to go into multifamily bonds too much because really the name of the game right now is getting ready for the 9% in February, but if you're doing a 4% deal, this is where you're going to come in. All developments have to do both a program certification and a construction certification. Just read the disclaimer or the instructions rather here at the top. This needs to be submitted by every single general partner who's participating. We don't need an original wet ink or blue ink signature. An electronic is just fine. For those who are kind of computer savvy, the easiest way to do is just go into Insert Pictures, navigate to where you've got your signature file saved, and then just drop it right there. If you really want to be fancy, you can kind of set your transparency color and do that. And that's it. That's all you need to do. OHFA will accept that as it is. It does not need to be any more complicated than that. You do it for all of your GPs, and then again, you come over to construction certification. You have it for your architect and design contracting staff as well, which is a slightly different modified form. Okay, so that's the bulk of the AHFA. I'll go quickly again through the competitive scoring tabs. The only changes you're going to see here are those that are necessary to reflect updates that were in the qualified allocation plan. So a lot of it's going to look similar to what you had last year. General information regarding your project at the top. To the top left, you see that there are kind of threshold checkers, different marks to make sure that you're hitting the number of bedrooms that are necessary if you're competing at a higher opportunity rate. You can see, for instance, that the census tract we entered was considered high opportunity, which means we are in the wrong pool. This is an ineligible tract. High opportunity deals should be competing in family, which means I'm at a place now where I need to rework my proposal. From that, you go down into the competitive section. When you figure out which points you want to pursue, you just select them. Make sure that you see the teal turn into green. That means that it's been elected as the point category that you will go out for. A lot of this has different information that's linked to it already. Just kind of proceed through that. Again, we have gray cells here that are grayed out because you might not necessarily be able to change them, and teal cells where you can enter them in. I will say that kind of as maybe a warning that we have enough information for each point category to kind of clue you into what's needed. So for, here, if you're going after new market tax credit points, we say, that you need to submit a commitment letter or equivalent. But certainly go back to the QAP and read the full text. This is just enough to clue you into what's necessary. It's not going to be the exhaustive definition of what qualifies and what doesn't. Always, always, always the QAP is going to be controlling. If the AHFA is less definitive, less descript, the qualified allocation plan will always be the basis upon which OHFA makes its final decision. As I said before, as you're going through this, because so much of it does calculate back towards other parts of the AHFA, make sure that you're checking in on it. So the big area where we see that is here in credits per affordable unit. If on Tuesday you look at this and you say, oh, perfect, I'm right where I need to be, I'm getting full points, that's fantastic. just make sure you check back on Thursday after you fiddle around in the budget tab to make sure that you're still maintaining full points. One of those kind of great cross checks. So the one area that I can show you that has changed is here in supporting integrated communities, which is required in the new affordability pool. And this allows you to seek points for the senior alternate here. And it just lets you know whether or not that's been met based on what's already contained in that budget tab at the top. And again, there's not a lot of changes here. If you're doing school points, just be aware that there's 1.5 million school districts in Ohio. There's 1.5 billion individual schools listed in Ohio. These are very small drop downs. So certainly you can either scroll in to make it easier, or what some people do that kind of helps is we have all of the school data. This pulls from the tab over here. You can just do a control find and search for the school that you're looking for. And then once you see what it is, kind of copy it and paste it. And that way you don't have to kind of go through 1 million different drop downs. But just an option. And then finally on tiebreakers, just, again, be very careful to check in all of your different data sources and make sure that everything is exactly where you think of it as supposing to be. And then the only other big change you'll see, big being relative, is that there had been a local initiatives section down here. Local initiatives is a program that OHFA offers in the first year of every 2-year QAP. We are now in the second year of a QAP, so it's been removed. It's just not in the QAP anymore. It's no longer applicable. So those remain true across all of the different pools that we have. I'm just going to show you really quickly the new pool. We've added a tab for Fact 50, which of course I'm going to need to go in and tweak because it's still showing it's not unshading. But the big thing to realize here is that this is an incredibly small tab. This is not nearly as exhaustive as all of the other pools because the type of information, the extent of the information that OHFA is asking for is very, very small. So it does look like I might have a shading error on here that I'm going to need to go in and look at. So do not be surprised if there is a new AHFA at the end of the day today. Maybe not. See, I should have just followed the advice that I was telling all of you guys. If it's not shaded, or if it is shaded and you don't think it should be, go back to your project tab and make sure. Okay, so to wind down here and to move very, very quickly, we have Bond Gap and National Housing Trust Fund. Both of those rounds are over for this year. We do not have the guidelines for next year, so they're more here for historical reference than a whole lot of anything else, but here they are. This is the data tab where all of the competitive information and all the QCT and a lot of the other drop downs are going to pull from. It's all locked, so you can't change it, but you can certainly come in here and fiddle with it and examine it. You can copy and paste it into a different sheet if you want to, kind of manipulate it and, filter down to the different tracks or qualities that you think a good project would have. And then over here is kind of the county level stuff. And then this is where you get your rent information from kind of the master eligibility. We have the school district tab. Again, this is all data. It is all locked, but it is all available to be viewed. The OHFA data extract tab is not something you're ever going to need or probably ever care about, but this is basically what OHFA does at the end of all of the application season is we run an extract, we pull all of this information out, and then we feed it up into DevCo. So this is kind of how we populate your profile in our own internal computer systems. And then at the very, very, very end, we have these cells, or I'm sorry, these tabs that are completely unlocked. You can do whatever you want here. This is for your formulas, your notes to yourself, your to-do list, whatever you want. The big thing, just, our underwriters do not ever go into these tabs. I certainly wouldn't curse them out in there because that's the one time they will be looking, but don't write anything in here that is critical to scoring, to eligibility, because these really are for you and not for us. So that is the AHFA demonstration where I'm 4 minutes over how quickly I had hoped to be able to do this. I apologize if that did not respect your time. As you all know, tomorrow is my last day here at AHFA. I'll be transitioning to a new position beginning on Friday. So if you do have follow-up questions about this document, you need tips and tricks, or you just need to be able to know where to go on our website to find the recording of today's session, do not email me personally. Email OHFA in general at qap@ohiohome.org. And with that, I'm going to conclude. And are there any final questions that I can answer for all of you guys before I let you head out? Crickets. All right. Well, thank you so much for your hour this morning. You have a great afternoon. Hopefully, I'll be seeing you all very soon. Have a great holiday season. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.